So you took a blurry photo. Well, you probably should just quit photography and move on to something else because you suck at it. Well, no, just kidding. But you know, honestly, sometimes when I'm taking photos, that is what I think about my photos. I'm like, ah, it's so frustrating when you're taking photos and you get blurry ones, and it's just quite annoying. But I found that there's really only 2 to 3 reasons why your photos become blurry. And we're gonna go over those in this video. That way you can always get tack sharp photos and know why if something is blurry. Unless you wanna get blurry photos, because that's kind of a thing right now, isn't it? I saw this chair when I was reviewing the footage and it was greatly annoying me in frame, so we're removing it. My name's Will, welcome back to the channel. It's always good to see you again. Don't forget to hit this like button and subscribe. If you haven't already, we cover all things photography. Just a quick note before we get started with this video, I just want to say there is no reason, if you watch this entire video, that you should have blurry photos ever again. Focus. Now, there's really, like I mentioned in the beginning, only about three things that cause blurry photos. And the third one you might be surprised about, but we'll get into that later. The first one is very, very simple. It's missed focus. You're taking pictures, you're shooting, and your focus is off where you want the subject to be. So you're shooting subject A here, but your focus is over here, slightly to the right. Now, there are a couple of ways to handle this. The first one, and all cameras are slightly different, but the first one is a focus setting called servo. Now, this is autofocus, but what it does is it keeps the box, the focus point, on your subject, or to the best of the camera's ability. Obviously, the better the camera is, the better the autofocus is gonna be, and it keeps the focus on them. Now, this can mess up where the camera will switch, where it will jump from your person, and it'll find something that's slightly higher contrast, and it'll jump to that, and that can happen too. So I always recommend double checking and making sure your focus is still good. I've had it where sometimes I have the camera and I have it on servo and it's tracking my subject and I'm taking pictures, but for some reason it jumped and started focusing on something in the back. So what you have to do is you have to release the focus to then set the focus again to make sure that you are on track. So that is really the main point of missed focus. Really practice with your autofocus and get it down, because eliminating that as a factor makes it so much easier to make sure you have sharp focus every time. Now, another side note to the missed focus is this photo, this style photo of out of focusness has become very popular, but I like to call it more of a motion blur kind of photo. It's not an out of focus photo. When you have a couple and they're running into the water and you want a blurry photo, now this is more in the aspect of motion blur, which is great. I think are really, really cool images, but I wouldn't necessarily call it missed focus. Now there is a photo where you have the couple in the foreground and they're blurry and your focus is on the background. Again, not necessarily missed focus, it's just adjusted focus. So these are very popular photos right now. It's kind of become a trend to have those blurry, motion blurry photos, but I think they just need to be categorized a little bit different. Now the next one is too slow of shutter. Now there are subcategories to this one, and we're gonna go over each one. The first one is auto modes. The camera, when you have it in auto mode, whether that be auto mode, aperture priority, program mode, or even shutter priority, your camera is going to adjust a lot of the settings. Now, your camera doesn't know what you're shooting. It doesn't know that you're shooting someone running by. It doesn't know that you're shooting someone who's dancing or walking or barely moving, swaying, and it doesn't know how fast your hands are moving when you're holding the camera. So it can adjust the shutter to be too low. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you're shooting outside, right? Fire, no problem. It's at 100 ISO, you're in auto mode, you're at 100 ISO, and there's plenty of ambient light, no problem. You're probably not gonna have an issue. But let's say you go inside, the light has completely changed, and let's say your lens can only go to an f4. Well, it's gonna drop it to f4, unless you have aperture priority mode. Let's say you're shooting in aperture priority mode, and you set it to f5.6. You're not sure what f-stop does, so you have it at 5.6 and fine. The ISO cranks up to 16,000 or whatever, and your shutter goes to 1/25 of a second. Now that's really slow to shoot someone, especially if you're hand holding a camera. If you have a tripod, maybe you can get away with it if the person is standing really still. But most of the time, your images are gonna be one, blurry, or two, not really sharp. So this is a really key point in knowing your settings. Don't just be the lazy photographer who looks at your photos and, oh, they're blurry, why is that? Learn your settings. Learn what the aperture and f-stop are, learn what the shutter is, and learn what the ISO is. I have tons of videos on that, so I'll link them in the description, but learn those, and that will handle probably 90% of your sharpness. The next one is low light. Now, this kind of goes into the auto modes and whatnot, but if you're handheld holding and you walk into somewhere that's dark, like you go inside, just like our previous example, and you're in an auto mode, the shutter's gonna go way low. So again, that just leads onto that one. So that is what's gonna happen. To get more light, to get the proper exposure, the camera's gonna drop the shutter quite a bit. And finally, the next one is your millimeter. Now, each lens has a focal length. Now, if you look on your lens, you might see 18 to 35, 70 to 200, 24 to 70, 50, something like that. Now, what does that have to do with sharpness? Well, movement is magnified in those lenses. The longer the lens, the more sensitive your lens will be to movement. Even the movement of your hands can affect the softness and sharpness of a photo. For example, if you're shooting a 50 millimeter and you're at 1/50th of a second, you might be okay as long as there's no other movement in the image. Let's say you're taking a picture at 1/50th of a second, you take the picture, your hands move, you're gonna get a slight softness. But if your subject is moving, it's not gonna be sharp at all. So my rule of thumb here is double the millimeter length. Now, if you're shooting at 50 millimeters, you need at least 1/100th. I still think that's a little slow. I think the minimum personally is 1/125th. Some very stable hand people can get away with slower, and some cameras have really good image stabilization, but I'd rather be safe than sorry, to be honest. So start with a minimum of 1/125th. Now let's say you're shooting at 200 millimeters. So what should you shoot at? That's right, at least 1/400th of a second. Now let's say you're shooting a car that's driving by and you want to freeze it in motion. Well, 1/400th of a second is not going to be fast enough. You might be able to do it with 1/2000th of a second, maybe faster. The way I recommend it is just keep raising the shutter until you get the sharp photo you're looking for. Again, if you don't care about a certain effect with using a shutter, you can raise your shutter to 1/8000th of a second and adjust everything else and be totally fine. Now, it might be completely unnecessary, but you could if it doesn't harm your photo in any way. If you're not going for any motion blur, if you're going for perfectly sharp and you have enough light to account for 1/8000th, sure, why not? One other thing that can make photos blurry is your f-stop. Lenses these days have down to like a 0.8 I've seen f-stop. Now that is such a small depth of field that means that if you focus on the tip of someone's nose, the back of their nose will be out of focus. Their eye will be out of focus. If you focus on their eye, their nose is going to be out of focus. I mean, this is pinpoint accuracy when you're shooting at low f-stops. Now 2.8, you're probably doing totally fine. You focus on the eye, you're probably going to get the whole face in focus. But you go below 2.8, you're going to start to get blurry features on the face. So that is another thing to note. Depending on the f-stop that you're shooting with, that could also be causing soft images by simply missing focus by a millimeter. It's actually quite crazy. The images are amazing when you get them right, but you might have to practice a little bit. You should know to check and then retake the photo. If you're just firing away and not double checking and making sure your focus is on, then you can ruin an entire photo shoot that way. And there's no problem to be like, hang on 1 second, let me check something. Even at a wedding, I do that all the time. I'll take a few photos, I'll double check, make sure everything's tack sharp, and go, go, go. It doesn't have to take 5-10 minutes. It takes 5-10 seconds, maybe. So once you know what you're doing, double check, make sure you're in focus. Now the final one is the lens itself. There are so many different lenses, and you will find that there are sharper lenses. The easiest way to kind of judge this is more than likely the more expensive the lens, the sharper it's gonna be. Now that isn't fully true because I have a 50mm 1.8 that was $125 and that lens is so freaking sharp. I would actually say it's sharper than my 24-70 that I'm filming this video on right now, but the lenses definitely can account for softness of an image. For example, my 7200 f2.8 is one of the sharpest freaking lenses I've ever used. I can get the eye perfect. I mean, it is immaculately sharp. I absolutely love that lens. My 24-70, it's not bad either, but 7200, way sharper. It just is what it is. A really cheap, low quality lens will not be as sharp edge-wise as another one. Now, does that mean you can't get good photos? Absolutely not. You can still get good photos. To the common eye, no one's really gonna notice the difference. If you zoom in, you might notice the difference. So those are the main points of sharpness. If you get your focus perfect and you get your shutter speed perfect, your photos are gonna be pretty freaking sharp. There's not much else you can do to get sharper photos. So I hope that helps. Go ahead and hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you have any other tips and tricks that you recommend on sharpness, go ahead and comment below. If you want to check out some other videos, here's 2 for you to watch. And yeah, that's it for this video. See you later.